If you're watching a channel like mine, I imagine you have probably seen this video right here from DistroTube, basically explaining why the Vivaldi browser isn't actually open source. And recently I found an article from the Vivaldi team themselves basically explaining why they actually license their software in the way that they license it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that I did used to use the Vivaldi browser. I do think it's a really good browser. I don't think it's just proprietary garbage that no one should ever use. If you want to use it, hey, go ahead and use it. If you hate the software and you don't want to use it, that's also your prerogative. Do whatever you want on your computer. I don't actually care. What I wanted to explain today was, I guess, some more of the business reasons why a company may want to license their software in the way that they license it. Because Vivaldi, it's not entirely true to say that it isn't open source. It's under a dual license. So part of the software is closed source and part of the software is open source. So because of this, it wouldn't be free software. But if you just look at the open source part of the application, that part of the application actually is open source. And if you go and look on the Vivaldi website, you can actually get access to that source code and you can go see what the license is for yourself, but we'll get into that in just a bit. So let's actually jump into the article and then I'll start explaining some of the extra stuff. So to many people, the question of releasing Vivaldi's browser source code under a unified open source license seems to be clear cut. And before I read this article, I was pretty much under the same assumption. So I thought, okay, if the software is going to be free, as in monetarily free, I can't really see a justifiable reason to keep it closed source. But they do actually have some reasons for it, and their first one here is that we're providing Vivaldi for free. We make money from searches and partner deals. So they don't make money from selling your data or anything like that. Basically, the way they make money is by partnering with search engines and partnering with various websites. So if you do a search in the Vivaldi browser, so this, if you didn't see the title up there, is from the Vivaldi's business model page. Basically, if you do a search on the Vivaldi browser with any search engine besides Google, because Google doesn't actually have a partner deal with Vivaldi, basically they'll make a little bit of revenue from that. So similar to having sort of like an affiliate program with, say, Amazon or eBay or something like that. If you use, I don't know, DuckDuckGo, and you use that in Vivaldi, then Vivaldi will make a little bit of money from you actually doing that. But they also have affiliate deals with, websites like TripAdvisor, eBay, Amazon, Expedia, websites like this. So if you go and connect to any of these websites from the speed dial page on the new tab page of Vivaldi, basically it's going to be treated like any other sort of affiliate link. So if you go click on my affiliate link and buy something from Amazon, then I will get some money for that. If you go click on Vivaldi's affiliate link and you buy something from Amazon, then they will make some money from that. Pretty basic stuff. And then back in the main article, it goes on to explain, therefore allowing external people to have access to and potentially help with the source code shouldn't be any trouble, right? However, as with everything, it becomes a lot more complicated when you look at the details. And this line right here pretty much sums up everything that I'm going to say in this video. It's not as simple as, oh, we're just going to release Vivaldi as open source now and then be done with it. It's a bit more complicated than that. So the Vivaldi browser, as I said earlier, is part open source and part closed source. So Vivaldi is built upon 3 layers. We have the Chromium layer, which is the Chromium web engine. They can't do anything about that. That is licensed under a 3-clause BSD license and a couple other licenses, but it's well established that Chromium is an open source project. So that makes up the majority of the code for the Vivaldi project. And then you have the backend code, which is written in C++, and that will support things like ad blocker and notes and any of the other extra features that Vivaldi actually adds that aren't a part of the Chromium web engine. And then on top of that, you have the UI layer. Now, the UI is mainly written in HTML, CSS, and JS, and on Android, it's mainly written in Java. So, as I said, Chromium itself is open source. They can't do anything about that. No matter what they do, Chromium is going to remain open source. And then the backend for the application, so the stuff to add in the ad blocker and note support and all the other features like that, that actually is open source. So if you go to the Vivaldi website, you actually can go and download a copy of the Vivaldi source code. And if you go and actually have a look at the license for it, it is basically under an open source BSD license. Now, this line right here doesn't actually really tell you much because there's multiple versions of the BSD license, and there's multiple versions of the BSD license that are also considered to be open source. So I went and downloaded the source code just so I could check what the license actually was. And if we go and actually have a look at that, so in the Vivaldi folder, and we go down to the license, this license right here is a 3-clause, or that's too much zooming. This license right here is a 3-clause BSD license. Now the 3-clause BSD license is a open source license. So the backend code for Vivaldi is open source. However, the important part of Vivaldi, the UI layer, that actually is closed source. So you can go and download Chromium, you can go and download the source code for Vivaldi and basically compile Vivaldi and then have no UI layer. That is entirely fine. But you can't actually go and do that with the UI layer. The UI layer actually is closed source and they don't have to provide you with the source code for that. So basically, they describe this as 92% of the browser is open source coming from Chromium, 3% is open source coming from them, so that 3% is the backend code, and then 5% of the browser is basically the UI layer, and the UI layer, as I said, is closed source. And also, obviously, Vivaldi contains some third-party code, and they can't decide what the licensing for that is going to be, so those parts of the code basically are going to be licensed as they need to be licensed. So they can't control that, as they also can't control Chromium. And then, as they say down here, if the Vivaldi browser is so close to being released under a unified open source license, then why isn't it? And pretty much that can be summed up with this line right here. So it's the Vivaldi brand. Basically, the reason why anyone even bothers using Vivaldi is the fact that it has such a unique interface. So if you've never used Vivaldi before, basically it is a really, really customizable browser, which is very rare to see on the Chromium side. Obviously, there are lots of really customizable WebKit browsers and lots of really customizable Firefox-based browsers, but on the Chromium side, it's kind of rare to see something that is so customizable. And that's what makes Vivaldi unique. So if someone could just come along and just take the UI layer for Vivaldi and then make their own browser, why would anyone actually care about the original project? And this is something that they are actually really worried about. So, as they say here, should we be afraid of forks? And the reason why they actually are afraid of forks is because they are a very small project. So, let's take something like GIMP, for example. If someone goes and forks GIMP and gives it a different UI and gives it better features and gives it some other stuff, it's not like that fork is going to overshadow the original version of GIMP. Obviously, it can definitely become a popular program, but everyone who's using Linux right now has probably heard of GIMP if they have any interest in image editing whatsoever. And even people outside of Linux have probably heard of GIMP at least once or twice. Whereas Vivaldi is still a very, very small web browser. Obviously, it has a lot of users, but relative to something even small like Brave, it is a minuscule browser. So something could come along, take the source code for the backend, take the source code for the front end, and make a new browser, call it Vivaldi 2.0 or whatever they want to call it, and then make it so no one remembers the original Vivaldi browser. And because there is a company behind this application, and it's not just some random application on GitHub, that's not something they want to see happen. So even though it might be beneficial for the users for it to actually be open source in this regard, it's really not beneficial for them as a company. Now, also, they have a brand and associated trademarks to enforce as well. So because they are a company, they have these trademarks to enforce, and if they don't enforce the trademarks, then they're basically going to just lose them. So if someone did take the backend for Vivaldi and then did fork it and go do something else, it would need to be branded as a different product. They can't just call it Vivaldi 2.0, better Vivaldi, or whatever it is. Whereas if they went and, made it completely open source, there would be a bit less of a reason why someone couldn't do that. Now, because they do still have their trademark, it's still debatable in court whether that actually could be the case or not. But having the entire thing be open source is a bit harder to actually make that case, because someone actually can very legally just go and make a clone of the browser, which makes the argument that they have the ownership over their name a bit weaker. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so take everything I said there with a massive grain of salt, but that's how I see it anyway. The other thing is, let's say another version of Vivaldi did pop up, and it introduced features that completely go against their ethics. So let's say it's something like there's a Bitcoin miner in it or something. Now, if someone did fork the Vivaldi project and then put that in, even though it is a different project, it's still going to be attached to the Vivaldi name, and they'd much rather see that not happen, at least with their UI layer. So if it's a completely different UI and then they go and do the Bitcoin miner anyway, it's not as associated with the original project. Now, the obvious way they could completely get around this is to completely close source the project altogether. However, a lot of people on the Vivaldi team are big fans of open source software and free software, and they don't want to make it so that no one can see the source code whatsoever. So they've kind of had to pick this middle ground where some of it is open source and some of it is closed source, so someone still could take the back end and go and make something that is kind of against their ethics, but they at least can't take the UI layer, which is the most important part of the Vivaldi brand. Something I had never really considered is that open source processors can actually be really expensive as well. And the reason why I'd never considered this is because I've always looked at it from the developer side. So obviously, if you're a developer, it's not going to cost you any money to go and submit to a project. But what about on the submission side? Well, you either have to have someone who has a lot of free time, or you have to pay someone to go and look through those patches and make sure there's no malicious code in them, make sure no one's trying to bring in like a Bitcoin miner, make sure that the patch doesn't break anything, make sure the patch is actually doing what the developer says it's going to do, and it's not just a broken patch. And this all costs a lot of money or a lot of time. And the Vivaldi team doesn't really see that the return on investment for this is really going to justify it, even though they are entirely aware that they are missing out on code from absolutely brilliant developers who they just can't bring on the team. Maybe there's some kid who really likes the Vivaldi browser who is too young to be employed with them, or maybe the person already has a job and they can't really commit to a second job and they just want to do this on the side. And open sourcing the browser could massively improve the quality of the Vivaldi code. However, if it's going to cost them more to do so than it would cost them to do in-house, they can't really justify it from a business perspective. Now, another thing to bring up is the security benefits of going open source. Now, every time I mention this, someone cries about it in the comments section. There are security benefits of going open source. I'm not going to go into them today, but most of the code for Vivaldi comes from the Chromium browser, which is open source, and most of that they obviously don't write themselves. They have submitted patches before, but most of the code for the Vivaldi browser they don't write themselves. So most of the security patches come from Chromium, but there are still parts of the UI layer, specifically with the JavaScript, that could introduce security holes. And they do say in here that if there are parts of Vivaldi that will make it more trustworthy by going open source, they will consider actually making that part of their open source code bundles and then putting it under the same 3-clause BSD license and actually making that part of the UI open source. They won't make the entire thing open source, but if there are parts of it that will benefit from being open source, they will consider it. So what happens if the Vivaldi project dies? And as they say here, this is a totally valid concern. So a lot of people who work at Vivaldi, they came from Opera software and don't like the fact that it went from being a Presto-based browser to being a Chromium-based browser. And a lot of people in the team still hold some frustrations that this happened. So if you don't know the way that Vivaldi actually started, basically a lot of people from the Opera team, they didn't like the direction the browser was actually going, and they thought, okay, we're going to go make our own company and make our own browser and do it the way that we want to do it. Now it's funny that they don't like that it went from being Presto-based to Chromium-based, and they went and made a Chromium-based browser themselves, but I'm sure there's some reason why that happened. So they're annoyed about the fact that this browser had to die because Opera didn't want to make it open source. But what they say here, this entire paragraph can be summed up to this line right here. Ultimately, while this is something we want to address, it's not a pressing issue right now. So right now, their company is still going fine, and they don't think that it's going to collapse anytime soon. They're not going to switch from being Chromium-based to being Firefox-based or WebKit-based or anything else like that. So the way that I read this as, basically, maybe in the future they will open source it, and maybe if the company is going to collapse, they will open source the project then. So if Vivaldi is going bankrupt, they're going out of business, they might open source it then. Which I think, I don't want them to go out of business, but having it go open source is probably going to be better for everyone, except obviously for the company themselves. Now, one thing to keep in mind about releasing open source software is that once you've released it as being open source, it's not like you can just take it back. There's no take-backsies with open source software. If you release it under an open source license, it's going to basically be under an open source license in perpetuity. Now, the only way to actually make it be closed source again is pretty much to completely rewrite every single part of the browser that was made open source. So any of the code that was made open source has to be completely rewritten. And obviously this is going to be a massive time commitment and a massive cost commitment, and there's literally no benefit in doing that. All you're doing is just refactoring the code to do the exact same thing just so you can make it closed source again. So once you go open source, there's no way to go back. So for a company like this, it's safer to stay being closed source until they're entirely sure they want to be open source. And then once they do that, then they can commit to it. Now, one interesting thing about Vivaldi is that even though their license for the UI layer doesn't actually let you go and modify the code, they don't actually care too much about that. So as long as you're not trying to repackage the application, it's fine. They are entirely okay with you actually making patches that go and modify the browser, and they even allow this on their forums. So they say that for Vivaldi, it's actually much easier to actually go and modify it because most of the code is written in web-based languages, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Whereas, say, if you want to go modify the code for Chromium, I'm pretty sure that the Chromium UI is written in C++. And if you're going to, modify that UI, then you're going to have to recompile the application. So the ultimate question then is, should the Vivaldi browser be open source? And as you have hopefully seen, this is not an easy question to answer. Basically, the only people who will think this is going to be an easy question is if you're a diehard open source software supporter, a diehard free software supporter, or you are diehard in favor of businesses and want everything to be closed source. Those are the only people who are going to be super in favor of this. Everyone in the middle who has a nuanced position, basically, hopefully you can at least see why Vivaldi would want to keep their software licensed the way they do. I don't think they should be doing it. I do think that from the user perspective, it would be better for it to be open source so that you actually could go and fork the UI and have the choice to use, okay, I want to use this version of the Vivaldi UI or this version, rather than having to deal with the one version that they make for you. Even though it is highly customizable, there is a lot of stuff that I could think of that I'd want to do to Vivaldi that I really can't do and then go and release for other people to use. And along with that, if it was open source, if the UI layer was open source, you would be completely free to modify it. And if they are releasing the source code, it would have to be an unobfuscated version. If you go look at the Open Source Initiative's definition for source code, it can't be obfuscated. That does not count as source code. So they would have to release the proper source code for the UI rather than this obfuscated version, which would make it much, much easier to actually work with. So hopefully that has given you a bit of a better idea about why Vivaldi has decided to license their software in the way that they've licensed it. As I've said throughout this video, I don't think that they should have it closed source, but I can understand the business reason behind doing so. So I think that's pretty much everything for this video, but before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Corbinian, Craig, Nathan, Andrew, Montazar, Joseph, Peter D. Road, Tony, Donald, John, Mikael, Spagin, Thais, and Zilva. If you'd like to go support the channel, there is some links down below to my subscribe star, my Patreon, and some other links like that. I would recommend not using Patreon right now because I'm not sure how long the company is going to, be alive. I'm thinking they might go bankrupt soon because of the lawsuit that's happening. So I would recommend, if you're going to be a new supporter, please go over to Subscribestar or LiberaPay, or I'm also going to start up Buy Me a Coffee. I would only suggest using Patreon if you really don't want to leave the platform. Anyway, besides that, if you want to go check out my podcast, that is Tech of a Tea, available on Library and YouTube, and the audio version available wherever you listen to audio podcasts. Also remember to go check out this channel, available on Library, BitChute, and some other platforms as well. And remember to go smash the like button and leave me a comment down below, and remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that is pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.